Hi guys, so this is how I created a base for my gesture sculpture. So I'm using really heavy chipboard and I'm making a square base for my headstand sculpture. So I cut a top and a bottom and then I measured the sides and got the height that I wanted. So on the top piece, what I'm going to do is go corner to corner and find the center. So if you have a rectangle base, yours might look a little different, but I'm trying to find the center because that's where I'm going to put the wire to come out so I can attach my sculpture on it. And you will see there I did not draw a big enough line. So I'm going to make a little hole in the cover, the top piece. So when I create the base, then my wire will stick through and then I'm going to connect that to my sculpture so it has something to connect to so it holds it upright. So you can make a rectangle base. I mean, if you want to get super fancy, you can figure out how to do a circle base. But I want somewhere that my sculpture can live. I didn't want it to just be laying on whatever counter space or whatever that I could find to put it on. I wanted the base to be intentional. So I made a bunch of templates and decided the square was the best for my headstand sculpture. If you have a sculpture that's laying down, you're probably going to want a longer rectangle base. So just play around in class, and if you need help, let me know. So like I said, I'm finding the center in here, and then I'm just going to make a little 1/2-inch square around there. So I'm measuring a 1/4 inch out on each of those from the center. So that is a little 1/2-inch square, and then I'm just going to draw a little square around it, and I'm going to cut the hole out. So you want it centered so your sculpture's in the center of your base. Unless maybe you don't want your sculpture in the center of the base. So again, that's something you need to figure out based on what your idea is. And then of course, ask in class. So I'm going to try to cut this with an X-Acto knife. This chipboard is super, super thick. So it does not work on the first pass. You'll see I end up having to hold it up and punch it through. So just take your time. Make sure you do not cut your finger off. And then see, it doesn't go through, so I'm just going to hold it up and punch it. And then also be careful about the X-Acto blade popping out, because sometimes that can happen. And this hole does not have to be perfect, because we're going to end up covering up some of it with tape and just having the wire pop out. So if it's a little off, it's no big deal. And if you hear some Frank noises, I have Frank sitting next to me. Alright, so I got my top. And then so I have my top, I have the bottom, and then all 4 pieces for the sides are exactly the same since it is a square. And then I did play around with the height. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the bottom piece and do the same thing. I'm just going to figure out where the center is, because once I'm done, we're going to glue some wire in there. So I want to make sure it matches where I put the hole in the top. And then now I'm going to start putting my base together. So I'm just going to use some tape. And I'm going to tape it from the inside and kind of make it like a little flap. So the sides are going to come up. So if you have a rectangle, yours might look a little different, but it is going to be the same thing. So I'm just going to lay some tape down, and then I'm going to end up pushing that side up to create a box. And let's speed this up a little bit so you can kind of get the idea. So I'm going to do this same thing to all the sides of the box. You can use more tape if you want. If you have a rectangle and you have a longer edge, you probably want to add more tape. Then I'm just going to flip it up. And then It's probably not going to be 100% perfect. I am not that great at measuring and doing things straight. But it doesn't matter because we're going to end up covering this whole thing up with tape and some hot glue in the corners, so it'll be fine. Unless the gap is like really big, we might need to recut. But if it's just a little bit, it's fine. So I'm laying down all my tape. And then I'm going to fold it up, and then I'm going to tape it around so it sits up like a box. So you can see I'm kind of adjusting it a little bit because that gap is a little bit too big. And then so I'm just going to pick up the corners, put some tape on the outside, and just tape it around the outside first. I don't want the tape, try not to make the tape bulky in the corners. And then I just layer the tape over it. And then that's where there's kind of a gap, so I'm just going to use some tape. Kind of try to push it back a little bit. But I'm taping. And if you hear that noise, that is Frank snoring next to me. It's not me, I promise. So now I'm getting my box kind of put together. There are a little bit of gaps, but it'll be fine. And then I'm going to reinforce it around the edges. And then you don't want the tape, try to make it straight. Like, see, mine's kind of like, has a little crease in it. Try to make it smooth. And then you see that one's kind of going off the top. And then I'm going around the outside edges where the gaps are, and I'm just kind of taping it back. And it doesn't really matter too much, unless it's really bad. It doesn't really matter too much. But I'm going to go around the edges. And I'm trying not to have too many creases in there, but I'm trying to reinforce the edges. And then later we're going to cover this whole thing with tape. So this is just getting it secure. So keep working on that and getting it secure. Alright, so now I have it secure. Looks like a box. I'm going to take some hot glue, and this is kind of a pain because my box is small. You want to just go over all the gaps and fill it in. So I'm just hot gluing. And then if you have like an extra piece of mat board or cardboard or something that you can like smear it a little bit so it fits in the gaps, I would do that. I end up using a glue stick. That's not the best idea. Don't do that. That's just what I had in front of me. But just so it goes really in there, because you want this box to hold. But like I said, a better idea would have been an extra piece of chipboard or cardboard or something. And then so just go over all the edges until you think it's good. And let's speed this up a little bit. Alright, so now that I have it glued pretty good, I'm going to start taping. And I just go around, just take the tape and just start from top to bottom. And then you just want to overlap it a little bit. So we're wrapping it like a mummy. And you don't want it to be super bumpy, so try to keep it flat as you go. If there's some creases, I mean, it's not going to be that big a deal, but just try to keep the outside kind of smooth the best you can. And you're just going to go around and just keep going around with that tape until it's completely covered. Alright, now that it's completely covered, we're going to put some wire in there, and that's going to stick up. So you want a pretty long piece of wire. Longer is better for this because you can always cut it later. And then, sorry, my phone's about ready to fall out of the holder again. So I'm just going to put a lot of hot glue down there. And you do need to hold it in place. I let go of it and then it fell over. But I just kind of twisted the bottom of the wire a little bit and then just plopped it right there in the center. And then you can see it's like falling over. You need to hold it until it is secure. So don't just leave it like that like I did. And then once it dried a little bit, I actually added even more. Alright, so now that it dried, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some press and seal and cover the inside with saran wrap. So you can use saran wrap. I mean, you can even use a Ziploc. What I'm doing is because I'm going to be pouring plaster in there, you can also use concrete. And I don't want it to hit the chipboard because I don't want it to leach the moisture into the chipboard. So I have the inside covered with plastic wrap. I am pouring plaster of Paris in here that I mixed. You can also use concrete. We're using this to weight the base. Never put concrete or plaster down the drain. It will destroy your pipes and you'll need to call a plumber. So I'm just pouring enough to give it some weight. I would have done concrete, but I didn't have any because concrete would dry a little bit better, I think, have less moisture. Plaster, it's probably going to crack since it's so thick, but it doesn't really matter. So I waited overnight and it's nice and heavy, so my sculpture is going to be secure. You can notice I only poured it like halfway up. You do not need a lot of plaster, and you also don't want a giant plaster block because it will take forever to dry. That's why if I had my choice, I would have done it with concrete. So then I'm just going to make sure my lid fits on there. I have enough wire, and it is a little bit gappy, so I'm going to have to fix that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some pieces of chipboard in there, like as a support, because you don't want it to just be empty. I've seen some people, my coworker used cut off glue sticks as a support, so it doesn't really matter as long as you have something for the top to rest on. And then, like I said, you're not going to pour that plaster, or if you're using concrete, all the way up. So you kind of need to make it so the top has something to sit on. And then you can put some little pieces in there. It really just depends on your base, how heavy it is. And then you do need to cut it so it's flush with the top. Because if it's too high, your base is going to be too tall, your top layer. So this was a lot of trial and error. Like I said, you could put anything in there as a support. I didn't want to waste glue sticks, so I didn't use glue sticks, chopped glue sticks. And then it works pretty good. I know it's a little bit lopsided. One of my little card chipboard pieces is a little too tall. And then I'm just going to glue that right in there. So I'm just going to stick it to the plaster. So you do need the plaster or the concrete to be dry or it's not going to work. And then you can see it's a little bit too long, but I just kind of shove it in there and it's fine. You just want it so your top doesn't cave in. It has something to rest on. And like I said, this is a lot of trial and error. You might come up with a better way. And then I kind of have to hold that one in there until it dries. And I will say while I'm working on this, if you make a mistake, you can just lift the saran wrap out, rip out the wire, and re-pour it if needed. So don't worry if things aren't working the way you want. We can always readjust. So I'm just adding some more hot glue. And then I need to let that dry before I start messing with adding the top. Alright, so I'm going to test out my top again. I don't know if you guys can tell, but there is a little bit of a gap in there. But since I'm going to tape it, it'll be fine. Nobody's going to know but us. So now I'm going to let that dry. Now it's fully dry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of glue on the top there because I'm going to stick the top on. Then I'm going to glue around the edges. And I don't know if you'll be able to tell. I did do it a little bit crooked, so I had to kind of mess with it a little bit. And then I'm going to glue the edges down a little bit. And then this is where having a piece of cardboard or chipboard or something to kind of smear it so it's not like a big line of glue around the edge. So you want it to be as flush as possible. And you can also use that glue to kind of fill in the gaps. So you can see I'm kind of smearing that right there. That's what I'm doing. And then we're just going to go around all the sides. And there is a little bit of a gap there. It doesn't matter though. We're going to put tape over it. So let's start taping it. I'm going to tape all of the top one direction, and then I'm going to go over it the other direction. And I'm just going to kind of wrap it like a mummy, like I've said before. So you want just a nice flat layer of tape. I'm going to go around the edges. Try not to make it where it crinkles. Then you have that weird little edge. And then I'm also going to use this to kind of conceal the gap I have on one side because I'm not a good measurer. You can see it right there, but it's not going to matter. Nobody's going to know but us. So I'm just going to go around, and then I'm also doing that second layer on the side. And then remember, we are going to be covering this with magazine pieces and collage. So we're going to paint with paper. So you want a nice flat layer of this. But you're not really going to see the tape anymore once we do that. So it doesn't really matter. And it's going to conceal any gaps and things. And then once I get to the hole in the center, I'm going to tape up that hole right up to the wire. And again, once we put our sculpture on top, nobody's going to know that there's a hole there. All right, so let's speed this up. All right, it's looking pretty good. I got a nice layer of tape. It's going both directions. The hole's pretty much covered up. Got my wire hanging out for when I'm ready to attach my sculpture. And it's nice and heavy, so it's going to create a really nice base, and it's going to be secure wherever I display it. So we will attach our sculpture later once we're done adding the collage layer on top, our painted paper layer. But that's a nice, and then we can also cut that wire down if needed. And then I'm going to be attaching my handstand sculpture to this. So once you're done with your base, let me check it off. Let's just make sure it's going to work before we move on to our last step, finally adding the color in our final layer. And here's what it looks like as two separate pieces right now. So good job, guys.